So we start off with a blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot divrei Torah.
Amen.
Okay, excellent. Thank you all. All right, so we're going to pick up in verse at chapter 6, verse 1, and I think we're just going to pick up the first couple of verses. So let's just read the first two, and we'll go from there. Who would like to read?
I'll do so.
Okay.
Verse 1. And this is the instruction, the laws and the rules that the Lord your God has commanded me to impart to you, to be observed in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy. Verse 2. So that you, your children, and your children's children may revere the Lord your God and follow, as long as you live, all his commandments, all his laws and commandments that I enjoin upon you, to the end that you may long endure.
Okay, let's stop there for now, because I want to begin by concentrating on this distinction, which is made in the text between laws and commandments. In the very first verse, we read about the chukim and the mishpatim. So chukim comes from a root which means law, as in chok. But you then have to ask yourself the question, how is that different from mishpatim, or singular as in mishpat? If you look at the root for mishpatim, it's the same root as a word for justice. It has the root that is related to the word for a judge. Okay, so what do you guess would be the difference between a chok and a mishpat?
This is just of course, a guess, but is one commanded by God and one not?
No.
One kind of, they're both commanded by God?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know.
That would be a good guess, but it's not actually the distinction.
You know, like a society develops rules. And we've talked about how the society might be, the rules might be contradict the commandments, for example.
Sometimes that's true, and that is part of the mix here.
Like our speed limit is an agreed agreed convention.
Right,
Not,
but it's also a law.
oh,
No?
it is a law. Yeah, no doubt about it. Yes.
I mean, I thought it was. That's why I don't go over 60. But every once in a while, the truth is I do. So.
And then in the second verse, it says laws and commandments. So that would suggest that the rules are commandments, but not the laws.
Yeah. So you've got several words here that are roughly synonymous. Then, as you all know, it's a general principle that I maintain, that there are no extraneous words in the Torah. So there has to be something about these different words that entails keeping them in the text. So we have, sorry?
Yeah, I've got another word too that I don't see in the Hebrew, mitzvot,
Ah,
because that's a commandment too, isn't it?
yes, it is. And you do see it there, although it's kind of hidden away. It begins, V'zot ha-mitzvah. This is the mitzvah. And mitzvah is even a larger grouping. So underneath mitzvah, you have chok, you have mishpat. Those are subsets of mitzvah. So you have to ask yourself the question, what is distinct or what is special about a mitzvah? How do other words like chok or mishpah, how do they fit underneath that? You got mitzvot, you've got chok, you've got mishpatim. What is the relationship among these? It might be helpful to think of something we're more familiar with to come up with an analogy. In American law, we have a similar situation, that there are a number of words that are used roughly synonymously. Let's think of them. There's a law, what else is there?
Statute.
Statute, yes. Is there a difference between a law and a statute?
I think so. I think statutes, they get passed.
Statutes what?
I think statutes, you have to go through like government, through the structure. Whereas there's laws, I think, are sometimes, made by judges, by reviewing things and
Yes.
coming up with conclusions based on previous decisions. So they're not necessarily the same thing. They're not using the same.
One might be the result of governmental decision, and the other might be the result of judicial decision. So that's true. That is one of the distinctions. So we observe statutes. We also observe laws. Are there any times when one supersedes the other? Oh, Remy, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand. What did you want to say?
Since you're talking about laws, unwritten laws, written laws, statutes,
Yeah,
limitation, decrees. In cities, they are called ordinances, rules and regulation. Let me see, I'm thinking about our laws are really based on English, the Magna Carta, if I'm not, a lot of our rules and regulations, right?
now we're going way back, but yes.
Yeah. I'm also thinking, Rabbi, this verse 1 and 2, the words that come out to me other than the laws and the commandments are the verb, like command, observe, revere, follow. All of those have, they're similar, but have some subtleties in the meaning, and that's what these two verses are telling us.
Yeah, they are similar, and they're particularly similar in the sense that they are binding. One is obligated to follow them, even though their source may be different. So, for example, in Jewish law, you have something called a minhag. which means a custom. However, if this becomes universally adopted and followed, it becomes a law, and you're obligated to follow it. So, for example, Friday night rolls around and you have a cup of wine. There's nowhere in the Torah where it says you are obligated to have a cup of wine, but you do. Why? Because it is a minhag that has acquired the status of a law, even though it isn't a law. Can you think of any other examples in American law? Something which is started out as a custom, but then becomes a law? Well,
Well, suppose keeping your dog on a leash in a park. That might start out as a custom. And then
yes.
there might be some signs, but then eventually it becomes a law and a fine is attached to it. If you don't do it, potentially.
I think an even closer example is cleaning up after your dog. that started out just as sort of a matter of common courtesy, but now it is a kind of law. You have to do it, and if you have a dog, as I do, and you go to the dog park, and your dog makes its business, and you don't pick up the detritus of your dog's behavior, other dog owners look at you like you're a terrible person. It's not exactly a law, but it becomes kind of a law. It's a custom that becomes an ersatz law. So let's think about, in terms of Jewish practice.
What about lighting the Sabbath candles?
A very good example. Is that a law or a commandment or what?
Well, I think that it became a commandment during the time of rabbinical Judaism, didn't it?
Well, the idea that you have a blessing for the lighting of candles already intimates that it's something more than just a custom. However, stupid phone. It isn't always clear when we move from one category to the other. So, for example, in effect, lighting of candles is a custom which has become a law. The Torah nowhere says you shall light candles for the Sabbath. Doesn't exist. But it feels like a law.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Dan.
Yeah, but it's become not God's law, but human law.
How do you mean?
Assuming that God's laws are propagated in the Torah,
Yes,
613.
right.
Okay. Anything beyond that we do would seem to me to be a human adaptation For example, not mixing milk and meat in a meal. Doesn't
Okay.
say that in Torah. It says thou shalt not boil or see the kid in its mother's milk.
So that's about cooking.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
But certainly in terms of devout Jews, keeping kosher from that standpoint, I'm not talking about non-pork or
Right.
catfish or something. They're equally important, but in fact, that is something that the rabbis added, putting, as I've heard it described, a fence around the Torah.
That's right. It's a term that we call siyag l'Torah, which means a fence around the Torah. So that if X is the law, we say that the law is X plus 1, because that way we are sure not to break X.
Right.
Okay. So I have to tell a joke. I may have told this joke before. I wouldn't be surprised if I have, but it's really good joke. So Moses goes up to Mount Sinai and he receives the 10 commandments from God. And on the 10 commandments tablets is written, you shall not see a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses asks, well, so God, does that mean that you can't actually cook meat and milk in the same meal? God says, you shall not see the kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, well, does that mean you can't mix meat and milk together in the same dish before you eat it? And God says, well, does that mean that you can't, God says that you shall not see the kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, well, does that mean that you can't eat beef stroganoff because you've got milk and meat in the same dish? And God says, okay, Moses, have it your way.
Right. But what that joke also says is this is human interpretation of.
Yes. Yes. So where does human interpretation come into play here? I mean, you would think that it's pretty straightforward, but it turns out that how we as human beings enter into the process of what is a law and what is not a law, what is a reasonable way of understanding a law. We're not totally divorced from the process, which is in itself kind of an interesting thing. Our interpretations, our attitudes become a part of what the law is. It's much more dynamic, much more interactive than we normally would think. And it may be an explanation for why there are so many words for law. We've got a bunch of them right here. It may be that it has to do, as I forget which you suggested, it comes from, these words come from the source of the law, whether it's a judge or in the text itself or what have you. And that's certainly a possibility. But it may also be that it comes from how these laws strike us. So, if you're talking about two loaves of challah on a Friday night, that seems a different kind of law than you shall not commit murder, or let's say, you shall keep the Sabbath day. There, it's not a law that has obvious moral considerations, though you begin to look into it and you realize that there are. But that's a different order of things than to say you shall not mix two different kinds of
Fibers,
grain. What?
fibers, like in the
Yeah.
clothing.
That's right.
So I have a question.
Yeah, Judy.
My question is, are you saying that these laws, there are certain laws and rules that can be open to interpretation, and there are certain laws and rules that cannot be open to interpretation? And who decides? And it seems to me that if we do have some room to for interpretation, that might perhaps give an explanation over all the many different forms of Judaism that we find, the Orthodox, the ultra conservative, Reform, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. Yeah, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So my question was basically, how do we deal with that issue? And, who decides what's legitimate and what isn't? And of course, I know that this debate has been going on for quite a while. And in Israel also, a raging debate about who says whether your marriage is legitimate and who says whether your marriage is not.
That's true. And legitimate has a different set of meanings, depending upon who's making the judgment.
Yeah.
Legitimate might just mean recognized by an Orthodox authority,
Right.
or legitimate might mean recognized in the eyes of the state,
Uh-huh.
which are two very different kinds of things. So let's look at it this way. Let's look at a law like you shall keep the Sabbath to make it holy. Very open-ended, but as absolute a law as you're going to find anywhere. But is it more important than saying you shall not commit adultery? And once you move into the one way of understanding this is the domain of the law. You have laws that are ritual in nature, which are absolute. But you also have laws which are may not be ritual, but which are moral laws, and which are required and understood as being absolute. So nobody is arguing it's okay sometimes to commit murder. That's not a position anybody adopts, and they couldn't. Yeah, Remy.
Yes, sir. Thank you. My question is kind of connected to what you just said.
Good.
How can you, maybe I should look at keeping the Sabbath holy and then thou shalt not commit adultery. Out of that keeping the Sabbath holy, probably a lot of traditions, a lot of practices, a lot of rituals that came about from that particular commandment. Whereas in thou shalt not commit adultery, that is plain and simple. It seems to me, there are no rituals or tradition or practices that that come out from that commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. In keeping the Sabbath holy, it seems like there's a lot of Jewish traditions, practices, rituals from that. Or how can you differentiate those practices?
You're asking a very good question, because in point of fact, there are a lot of implications, let's say, to keeping the Sabbath holy and to refraining from adultery, adultery, which are serious moral considerations and which are serious legal considerations. What happens to somebody who commits adultery?
Rabbi, I think that is defined in Torah times as a woman shall not sleep with anyone other than her husband, because you have the story in Torah of who is it, Judah, who goes and sleeps with a prostitute,
Yes.
and it's not considered that he committed adultery. Now, I don't know if his wife was still alive at the time, but still, men visiting a prostitute was never considered, I don't think, in those times as committing adultery.
Well, it depends. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. In the case you're talking about with Judith and Tamar, they are both put to death because there's a breaking of the marriage vows. And that's enough to lead to a capital offense. What I'm trying to get at is that even though it might be possible for a man to have more than one wife, it's not necessarily possible for a man to have numerous sex partners who are not his wives.
Well, except that you do with Jacob. He's got 2 wives and he's got 2 handmaids. And that's where the 12 sons come from on Dinah.
That's true. But what happens to Jacob?
I'm not sure your question.
Well, these 2 handmaidens, what's their status?
They're concubines, essentially, aren't they?
Well, that's certainly how they start out. But does Jacob marry them?
I don't think so. They don't have the same status as Rebecca, as Rachel and Leah.
That's true. They don't have the same status. However, their children become the basis of tribes.
Right. They are, the children are acknowledged.
They're
by Jacob.
acknowledged, and that would be a pretty high status. So the implication is they're not just illegitimate children. There's something more than that. So let's back up a minute. In the case of the patriarchs, all of their children, well, not all of them, most of their children become the foundation for tribes, but not all.
No, Ishmael.
That's right. Ishmael is a good example, but Ishmael becomes the foundation for something else.
A different religion.
Different tribe. I mean, a whole other
All
nation,
other people.
other people.
Yeah. So it's not as if these are simply simply random. There is a real significance to the progeny of the patriarchs, even though not all of them have the same status. Okay, so what does that mean? That would indicate one reason why there might be more than one term for the laws that surround the status of the birth of the children, as in the patriarchs and so forth. We might need to keep more than one term because the legal status is not the same. So in the case of one birth, the status is very high. In the case of another birth, not so high. But even though it's not so high, it remains within a certain ballpark. So for example, maybe the child of a patriarch and a matriarch has a certain legal status, even though the child of a patriarch and a handmaiden has certain legal status too. How can it be that the son or daughter of a patriarch might have a different legal status than another?
Rabbi,
Yeah,
I have a question in what you just said.
okay.
I'm thinking about Abraham and Sarah. Of course,
All
they
right.
have Isaac. Sarah died, and of course, Ismail, Hagar, and then Abraham has another wife named Keturah. And
Correct.
there are some comments that Keturah was Hagar. Her name was changed. I guess once Sarah died, Hagar became Keturah. You probably can shed light on that. So I'm kind of thinking about the children of Keturah with Abraham. I know they're probably in the Bible, but you never hear them. But I'm sure, like you said,
And why wouldn't you hear about them? Think about it.
what'd you say, sir?
Why wouldn't you hear about them? Why do you not hear about the children of Keturah?
No idea. I guess the focus is Isaac.
Well,
You know.
the focus is Isaac, and the reason that is because Isaac is in the line of succession, you might say.
Yeah.
Okay. But as it happens, the children of Keturah are also in the line of succession. But there's questions about it. Here's what happens. Let's say if you have in your family, as I have in my family, relatives who are, what do I want to say? that everybody acknowledges and everybody accepts and everybody respects. And then there are other relatives who are more problematic. So I have some aunts and uncles who are so-called, who are really not aunts and uncles. They are close friends of the family, and they are well thought of, but they're not really blood relatives. In my family, we had Jack and Molly Gingold, who were just very close friends of my parents. And I called them aunt and uncle, but they really weren't aunt and uncle.
Didn't we do that as a sign of respect? I mean, I also had a Grandpa Koner in our same Jewish family in the larger family, but they were not blood related at all. It was just, he was older than the ones I would call aunt and uncle. So our parents had, my sister and me called them grandpa, and but no blood relatives in any of those people.
Oh yeah, in my family, we had a fellow named Phil Hoffman who played poker with, oh, no, not poker, pinochle. It shows you more than dating, with my grandfather and two other people every Friday night. I don't come from a very frum background. Every Friday night for years at my grandmother and grandmother's house. This guy was not in any way related to the family. He was not, not a cousin, he was not an uncle, but we called him Grandpa because that's kind of how he fit in. What I'm saying is that family relations and who's a child of whom and who is a part of the family and who is not a part of the family is not just a matter of law. It's not just straightforward. There are all sorts of exceptions or gray areas that come into play. You would never, in my family, discount Phil Hoffman. He was a member of the family. End of story. Even though there was no real line of connection. And we all have these people in our families. The reason I bring this up is that we're looking at a text here which tries to explain in a very logical and legal way how people are related to each other. But I'm also pointing out that in point of fact, the way people are related to each other is much more complicated, much more squishy than the Torah tries to make it out to be. So as we're reading this text,
Rabbi,
yes,
there is a famous Jewish rabbi, who are my sisters and my brothers, who, you know,
yeah,
and his answer was, who really, who has the same values towards her relationship to God.
well, that's true in another sense. You know, if we are connected to people who may or may not have blood relations with us, but who share common experiences common history, and so on.
Or common values, Rabbi.
Or common values, yes, thank you.
So
Common
how,
values as
how
well.
does this connect to laws and commandments?
Well, that's the point. It's a very good question, and Kim is keeping us on our toes. What I'm suggesting is that laws and commandments are not the only way that we are related to each other. There may be laws and commandments that govern how people in a family are related, but in actuality, they're not the only way in which we are related to each other. And if you read onto the next verse, verse 2, you get a little bit of insight into this, so that you, your children, and your children's children may revere the Lord your God and follow, as long as you live, all his commandments, laws, and commandments that I enjoin upon you, to the end that you may long endure. What's being said here is that we are, all of us who are following the laws and the precepts and so forth that we get from God, are in some significant way related to each other. And this is part of what makes it so interesting in our own day to figure who is a Jew and who is not a Jew. If we just followed the laws having to do with blood relations, there are all sorts of people who we would have to exclude from the group of folks we call Jews. And
Here, I have to, my wife needs to use this now.
oh, all right.
But it seems it's about community. It creates community, the laws and commandments.
Yes, it does.
Oh, no, she said we're okay.
Oh, okay, good. So there is part of what makes us related to each other is not just the strict rules having to do with blood relations, but also with the understandings that we share about values, about customs, about, I guess you would say, more personal or understandings that are maybe not legal, but which have just as much force as the legal requirements do. So, for example, it's a part of the arrangement that we have worked out that that despite the rules of blood relations, we wind up having connections, family-like or maybe I guess you would say those relations which are binding, but which are not about blood.
Yes, Rabbi.
Yes.
The commandments of God, of course, the first four is focusing on God and then the parent, and then the other people. To me, if you follow those top four, revering God, loving God, you will revere the other, the people. And once you revere them, to me, it's not just your own clan, your own kind, but outside to that are not blood related or even of the same ethnic background.
Well, I think that that's a very good point, and the second verse points in that direction, because if you follow the rules in the first verse, what's the outcome? So that you, your children, and your children's children may revere the Lord your God and follow as long as you live all his laws and commandments that I enjoin upon you, so to the end you may long endure. Because there is a much larger and longer sense of continuity, sense of relationship outside of the question of blood relations. Blood relations is where we start. And there are, relatively speaking, kind of understanding of what it means to be related to each other. So we start off with people who are related, as we might say, by blood, who are fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers and so forth. But the reality is that we move far beyond that. The larger scheme here is that by virtue of shared values, shared understanding, we continue and expand the group that is part of our family. And who becomes the family is not limited, it's not restricted to just the blood relations, but to those who share a certain set of values, certain set of understandings, and so on.
And behavior.
I'm sorry?
And behavior.
And behavior, yes, thank you. And that shared sense becomes a way of understanding our relationship. That is it's a little larger than just the blood relations.
And it's also larger than laws and commandments
Yes.
themselves. I mean, I think that's really beautiful that this is really about family.
Yeah, I think so too. All right, well, we have reached the end of our time. I'm getting signals. So, all right, thank you all very much. And we will
Eric,
see you
thank
next
you.
week.
I'm glad you joined us.
I'm glad you
You
did
did. Have
too.
a good week, Stan, Kim, Rabbi. Thank
Yep.
you, Rabbi.
All right, see
Shabbat
you all later.
shalom for tomorrow night.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
Okay, bye.
bye-bye.